A Beaufort 7 sea state in the Arabian Sea is not the worst the ocean produces, but it is the worst that the Arabian Sea reliably produces in the pre-monsoon season, when the Shamal wind pushes down from the northwest and the swells build against it in a confused, irregular pattern that makes the wave heights unpredictable and the ship's motion something that experienced sailors describe as exhausting rather than dangerous. The distinction is important. A Beaufort 7 does not threaten a Ticonderoga-class cruiser's survival. It threatens the concentration, the physical steadiness, and the sustained performance of the people inside it. Everything takes longer in heavy weather. Every task requires more physical effort. Every decision is made on a body that has been working against the ship's motion for hours. And the accumulated cost of that work is not always visible until the moment when it matters most. USS Hué City had been operating in the Beaufort 7 conditions for 14 hours when the watch changed at midnight. The ship was rolling 11 degrees to each side on the primary swell axis and pitching 4 degrees in the cross swell, a combined motion that made standing in any space that did not have a handhold within arm's reach an act of constant low-level athletic effort. The coffee in the CIC had been spilled twice in the preceding watch. The navigation chart table was held flat by a friction lock that the navigator had engaged 4 hours earlier and had not had occasion to release. In the engineering spaces below the waterline, the motion was less. The deep mass of the ship damped the surface effects at depth. But the sound was worse. The structural groaning of steel flexing in a seaway. The intermittent percussion of wave impacts against the hull sides. The particular acoustic environment of a ship working hard in weather. The Hué City was on station as the outer air defense coordinator for a multinational task force operating in the northern Arabian Sea. Her SPY-1B radar was maintaining continuous air surveillance out to 300 kilometers in the primary threat sectors, tracking commercial traffic, filtering out weather returns that the Beaufort 7 was generating in quantity, and maintaining fire control quality tracks on 6 contacts of interest that the intelligence picture had flagged as potentially associated with Iranian military aviation activity in the area. The contacts were at the edge of Iranian airspace, not approaching, and the watch team's assessment of them had been consistent for 4 hours. Observe, track, log, and do not commit until the geometry requires it. At 12:47 a.m., the geometry required it. One of the 6 flagged contacts, an airframe that the SPY-1B had been tracking as a possible F-4 Phantom variant operating out of Bandar Abbas, executed a course change that took it from its holding pattern at the edge of Iranian airspace to a direct southward heading toward the task force's operating area. The change was sharp and immediate, not a gradual drift but a committed turn, and the acceleration profile that accompanied it was inconsistent with a patrol or a transit. The EW system detected the activation of the KH-55 targeting radar associated with the Noor anti-ship missile system at 12:47:19 a.m. The airborne fire control radar that the Iranian Air Force used to designate targets for the Noor before the missile's own seeker took over in the terminal phase. The Noor is a weapon derived from the Chinese C-802. Iran has manufactured it domestically since the early 2000s and has invested in iterative improvements to the seeker head, the propulsion system, and the electronic countermeasures architecture that governs how the weapon responds to jamming. The most current variant, the one that the intelligence community assessed as the primary armament of the Iranian Air Force's anti-ship strike packages, incorporated a seeker mode that used frequency agility and pulse compression to resist the jamming architectures that the U.S. Navy's EW systems were optimized for. Not immune to jamming, resistant to it in a way that increased the jamming power required to defeat the seeker and reduce the reliability of the defeat at the ranges where the Hué City's EW systems operated most effectively. The Teo had the threat picture at 12:47:22 a.m., 3 seconds after the targeting radar activation. He committed the SM-2 battery to a long-range intercept attempt and activated the ship's electronic attack systems against the Noor's seeker frequency band simultaneously. Both actions were correct. Both actions were executed in the time and manner that the training system produces them. The SM-2 launched at 12:47:31 a.m., climbing into the heavy weather that had put a return clutter floor on the radar scope that the fire control system was compensating for automatically. But that was adding uncertainty to the intercept solution at the margin. The first SM-2 missed. The miss was not attributable to a single failure. The Noor's seeker had been executing a frequency agility pattern that the EW system's jamming had partially disrupted but not fully defeated, and the partial disruption had caused the missile to deviate from its primary approach vector by a margin that the SM-2's intercept solution had not accounted for because the intercept solution had been computed against the primary approach vector. The second SM-2 was already in the air when the first missed. The TAO had fired in pairs, and the second weapon had received an updated intercept solution based on the observed deviation. The second SM-2 detonated within the lethal radius of the Noor at 12:48:04 a.m. The fragmentation pattern from the SM-2 warhead reached the Noor's airframe and produced damage to the missile's left wing assembly and partial disruption of the seeker's power supply. The damage was not terminal. The Noor continued on its approach in a degraded condition. A missile with compromised aerodynamic symmetry and a seeker operating at reduced power, homing on the Hué City's hull radar return in a terminal guidance mode that was less precise than nominal but still functional. The Phalanx acquired the degraded weapon at 12:48:19 a.m. and fired. In Beaufort 7C conditions, the Phalanx mount is subject to the ship's roll motion. The system compensates for roll through a stabilization algorithm that tracks the ship's attitude and adjusts the mount's firing solution in real time. The algorithm had been performing correctly for 14 hours of continuous heavy weather operation. At 12:48:21 a.m., on the third burst of the Phalanx engagement, the ship rolled 4 degrees faster than the stabilization algorithm's update rate. A sea state transient caused by a breaking wave crest that struck the hull at the moment of firing and added a rapid angular velocity to the ship's motion that the algorithm's filter had not yet processed. The third burst went low. The Noor impacted the Hué City's island superstructure at 12:48:23 a.m. The superstructure of a Ticonderoga-class cruiser houses the most critical operational spaces on the ship. The Combat Information Center, the nerve center of the entire Aegis system, the space from which every tactical decision is made and every weapon is controlled, occupies the interior of the superstructure at the main deck level, protected by the steel of the surrounding structure but not armored in the sense that the word applies to dedicated armored vehicles or warships of an earlier era. The superstructure is designed to resist weather, to support the antenna arrays mounted above it, and to provide a working environment for the people inside it. It is not designed to absorb a warhead detonation at contact range. The Noor's warhead detonated at the point of impact on the starboard side of the superstructure at a height of approximately 6 meters above the main deck. The detonation energy propagated inward through the exterior steel, through the equipment spaces that lined the superstructure's interior, and into the CIC in a combination of overpressure, fragmentation, and thermal effects that were, in the subsequent investigation's language, inconsistent with continued operation of the space. The overhead lighting failed instantly. 4 of the 6 primary display consoles failed within 2 seconds as power distribution panels in the superstructure were destroyed or disrupted by the blast. The SPY-1B radar processing units located in a space immediately adjacent to the detonation point on the starboard side sustained damage that took both primary and secondary processing channels offline simultaneously. At 12:48:25 a.m., 2 seconds after the warhead detonated, the Hué City had no functional CIC. 11 personnel in the CIC sustained injuries from the blast, overpressure, and falling equipment. The injuries ranged from lacerations and concussion to more serious blast trauma in the two watchstanders who had been closest to the starboard bulkhead at the moment of detonation. The damage control response to the CIC was immediate. The teams positioned in the adjacent passageways were inside the space within 40 seconds, beginning the casualty assessment and initiating the first aid protocols for the injured personnel, while simultaneously assessing the space for fire risk from the electrical damage. The fires that ignited in the superstructure equipment spaces were 3 in number: a cable run fire in the starboard electronics space, a small burning insulation fire at the base of the destroyed power distribution panel in the aft CIC equipment bay, and a fuel-fed fire in a voice communications equipment rack whose cooling system had failed and whose internal components were generating heat. All 3 were accessible from the interior passageway system. All 3 were addressed by DC teams within 4 minutes. The cable run fire required 9 minutes to fully suppress because the fire had traveled along the cable run into a section that the first team could not physically reach without dismantling a section of overhead cable tray, which the second team accomplished while the first team held the fire line. The last fire in the superstructure was declared under control at 12:59 a.m., 11 minutes after the warhead detonation. But the combat picture had not waited 11 minutes. The F-4 that had launched the Noor was still airborne and within range of the task force. The SPY-1B was offline. The CIC was offline. The Hué City was, in the precise tactical sense of the term, blind, not entirely without resources, not without options, but blind in the way that counts in combat, without the integrated, networked, computer-processed air picture that the Aegis system provides and that every tactical decision the ship makes is normally built around. What the Hué City had in that 11-minute window was the backup combat system, a capability that the Navy had invested in specifically for scenarios where the primary system was unavailable, consisting of a secondary command and control node in the ship's secondary con space, a separate radar system with significantly reduced range and processing capability compared to the SPY-1B, and the communications links to the task force's other units that had not been routed through the destroyed superstructure spaces. The ship's executive officer had been in his sea cabin when the warhead detonated. He was in the secondary con space at 12:49:01 a.m., 38 seconds after the detonation. In those 38 seconds, he had moved from his cabin, assessed the damage visible in the superstructure on his way through the interior passageway, recognized that the CIC was not going to be available, and made the decision to establish the secondary command node without being told to. He had been told nothing. He had seen what he had seen and drawn the correct conclusion, and was at the backup system before anyone had formally communicated to him that he needed to be there. The secondary radar system had a range of 120 kilometers compared to the SPY-1B's 300. It could not maintain the track quality or the contact count that the primary system had been providing. What it could do was acquire large, close contacts, and the F-4 at its current range of 68 kilometers was within the secondary system's acquisition capability. The executive officer had a track on the aircraft at 12:49:44 a.m., not a fire control quality track, an awareness track, sufficient to know the aircraft's bearing, approximate range, and heading, from which the tactical picture could be partially reconstructed. The task force was not a single ship. The Hué City's loss of the primary air defense coordination function had not left the task force without air defense. The other units in the formation had their own Aegis systems, their own radar, their own weapons. What they had lost was the coordinating authority that the Hué City had been providing. The ship that was supposed to be deconflicting the engagement picture, assigning sectors, preventing fratricide. Without the Hué City's coordination function, each ship was defending itself independently, which was operationally degraded but not operationally disabled. The executive officer got on the task force command net at 12:49:51 a.m. and transmitted a situation report in the flat informational register of someone who has processed the emergency and moved past it. The Hué City's primary CIC was offline. She was operating on secondary systems. The F-4 was at the given bearing and range, and tactical coordination was temporarily passing to the next senior unit in the formation. The transmission took 12 seconds. The next senior unit acknowledged at 12:50 and 9 seconds AM and assumed the coordination function. The F-4 did not launch a second Noor. The subsequent intelligence assessment attributed this to the aircraft's weapons load. The Noor requires a specific pylon configuration, and the standard Iranian Air Force loadout for this aircraft type carried 1 missile per sortie, not 2. The aircraft's pilot had expended his weapon and was now a combat aircraft with no anti-ship armament operating in an airspace where the task force was now tracking him from multiple platforms simultaneously, and where his continued presence served no tactical purpose. He turned north at 12:51 AM. The task force tracked him to the edge of Iranian airspace and logged his departure at 12:58 AM. The 11 minutes between the warhead detonation and the superstructure fires being declared under control were, in the assessment of the damage control coordinator who would later write the after-action report, not 11 minutes of crisis management. They were 11 minutes of execution. The distinction was not semantic. Crisis management implies improvisation, a response that is being invented under pressure. What happened aboard the Hué City in those 11 minutes was the execution of training that had been conducted, repeated, refined, and conducted again until the procedures had been absorbed so completely that the Beaufort 7 conditions, the injuries, the darkness in the CIC, and the smoke in the superstructure equipment spaces were inputs to the response rather than obstacles to it. The DC teams moved through smoke wearing oxygen-breathing apparatus because they had trained to do exactly that. The fires were addressed in the correct sequence, the one that minimized the risk of propagation, because the sequence had been drilled until it was faster than thinking about it. The sound-powered telephone network was the backbone of the coordination because everyone in the damage control chain had been told, repeatedly and specifically, that the sound-powered telephone would still work when the modern systems would not, and when the modern systems did not work, they used it without surprise or hesitation. None of this was improvised. All of it was prepared. The 11 minutes looked like a crisis from the outside and looked like a job from the inside. And the difference between those two perspectives is the product of every training evolution that had ever been conducted on that ship before 12:48 AM. At 1:03 AM, with the superstructure fires confirmed under control and the casualty count documented, the damage assessment team began the systematic evaluation of what could be restored and what could not. The SPY-1B processing units were destroyed, not repairable at sea. The 4 failed CIC display consoles were a combination of physical damage and power supply failure, 2 of which were repairable with the spare parts carried in the ship's electronic repair locker. The power distribution panel in the aft CIC equipment bay required complete replacement, which was not possible at sea with the materials aboard. The starboard electronic space was physically accessible, and its equipment, while damaged, included components that could be cannibalized to restore partial function to 2 of the CIC's secondary display circuits. The ship's electronics technicians worked the restoration sequence with the methodical urgency of people who have a clear problem and a clear goal, and who understand that every hour of partial capability is operationally costly to the task force they are supposed to be protecting. The 2 repairable display consoles were restored to function by 2:17 AM. The cannibalized circuit restoration was completed at 3:44 AM. The power routing workaround that partially restored power to the secondary CIC systems was operational at 4:09 AM. At 4:09 AM, the Hué City had a partially functional CIC, 4 display consoles operational, the secondary radar system providing the air picture, the fire control system operating at reduced capability, and the communications circuits fully restored. She did not have the SPY-1B. She would not have it at sea. But she had a command node, a weapon system, and a crew that had managed a warhead detonation in her most critical space. 11 injured personnel, 3 superstructure fires, and the temporary loss of task force coordination in 11 minutes of sustained emergency response. And had come out the other side with the ship mobile, the fires out, and the tactical picture being rebuilt from the secondary systems before the aircraft that had struck her had finished its transit back to Bandar Abbas. The ship's damage control officer had been compiling the post-engagement report since 1:03 a.m. in parallel with the electronics restoration effort. Because the fleet commander required a formal damage assessment within 2 hours of any combat engagement, and the 2-hour window was closing while his teams were still working inside the superstructure. He compiled it from reports transmitted by sound-powered telephone from the teams in the field. The old reliable technology that had been aboard American warships for 80 years. And that was immune to the power supply disruptions that had taken the modern communication systems partially offline. Sound-powered phones do not require electricity. They require a human voice and another human ear and a wire between them, and those 3 things had been available and functional throughout the engagement. The report that reached the fleet commander at 2:01 a.m. was complete, accurate, and in the standard format that the fleet staff required for processing. It contained bad news. The SPY-1B was a total loss. The CIC required shipyard-level restoration. 2 personnel required higher medical care. And it contained a bottom line that the fleet commander read and noted. The ship was mobile. The fires were out. The crew was operational, and she was back in formation. The medical officer's assessment of the 11 injured personnel was completed at 1:44 a.m. 2 required the level of care that the ship's medical facility could provide, but that would benefit from transfer to a medical ship as soon as conditions allowed. 9 were treated and returned to limited duty. The 2 most seriously injured were transferred by helicopter to the USS Comfort medical ship operating in the southern sector at 7:22 a.m. When the Beaufort 7C state had moderated sufficiently to make the hoist evolution safe, the Hué City held her position in the task force formation. At the task force commander's option, she was repositioned to the secondary air defense role, rather than the primary coordination role, a position that allowed the task force to retain her Aegis capability in a defensive function while using a fully operational unit for the primary coordination task. The repositioning was complete by 5:15 a.m. The Hué City resumed watch standing in the secondary role at 5:20 a.m., her secondary CIC operational, her crew at a modified watch schedule that accounted for the injuries and the extended emergency response, her fuel state sufficient for 48 more hours of operations. Here are the numbers when the watch schedule normalizes and the ship is back in position. 14 hours of Beaufort 7C state before the engagement. 12:47 a.m. Targeting radar activation by the launching aircraft. 2 SM-2 interceptors committed, 1 achieving partial intercept. 4 degrees per second. The roll transient that defeated the Phalanx stabilization algorithm on the 3rd burst. 2 seconds from warhead detonation to total CIC loss. 11 personnel injured in the CIC at the time of detonation. 3 superstructure fires, all under control by 12:59 a.m. 38 seconds from detonation to executive officer at the secondary command node. 4 hours 9 minutes from CIC loss to partial operational restoration. 2 personnel transferred by helicopter at 7:22 a.m. 0 fatal outcomes among the crew. The Iranian strike had achieved what the Noor was designed to achieve. It had placed its warhead inside the most important space on the ship. The weapon had performed. The detonation had been in the correct location. By any technical measure of the engagement, the weapon had done its job. What the weapon could not do was account for the 38 seconds it took a ship's executive officer to reach a backup command node he had never been formally ordered to occupy, or the 11 minutes in which the task force transitioned coordination authority without losing a single defensive engagement, or the 4 hours and 9 minutes of electronics work in a damaged superstructure that ended with a partially functional CIC instead of a dead one. The Beaufort 7 sea state continued through the morning watch. The Arabian Sea does not moderate for damage reports. The crew of the Hué City worked in the same rolling, pitching, groaning ship that had made the preceding 14 hours exhausting, and they restored what could be restored and held what had to be held, and the ship remained in formation. In combat, remaining in formation is not a small thing. It is sometimes the only thing.